The Cal-Neva Lodge sat on the California-Nevada state line above Lake Tahoe like a wooden castle nobody had quite finished building. June 1979. 14 years after Sinatra had lost his gaming license over the place. 6 years before the building would change hands again and start its long slide toward the version that exists today, restored and reopened decades later as something closer to a museum than a casino. Right then, that night, it was still a working room, still drawing high rollers up from the Bay Area and down from Reno, still running tables until 4 in the morning under low brass light fixtures that had not been replaced since the Rat Pack years. The high-stakes room was at the back, past the main floor, behind a door with a man standing in front of it who knew your face or did not let you through. Inside, 4 blackjack tables and 2 private poker sit-ups. A bar in the corner staffed by a bartender named Lou Carbone, who had been pouring drinks at the Cal-Neva since 1968. The carpet was worn, but still thick enough to swallow footsteps. The walls still carried the old knotty pine paneling from the lodge's original construction, dark with 40 years of cigarette smoke that no amount of cleaning ever fully lifted. If you were in that room, you were either rich or you worked there. There was no third category. That night, June 14, 1979, both ends of the room were occupied. At the back table, a man named Dominic Resta was running a private poker game for 4 regulars, men who flew up from San Francisco every few weeks and lost money the way some men donate to charity, as a kind of social obligation they had stopped questioning years ago. Resta was 49 years old. He had owned a minority stake in the lodge's gaming operation since 1976, bought in through a holding company that kept his name off the State Gaming Commission's more visible paperwork. And he ran the back room the way certain men run small fiefdoms, which is to say, loudly, with the particular swagger of someone who has been the most important person in a small room for long enough to forget that the room is small. He had been drinking for 3 hours. He had been winning. At the front table, near the bar, Clint Eastwood sat alone. He had driven up from Carmel 2 days earlier, alone, the way he often traveled when he wanted to think rather than be seen thinking. He had just finished a picture that the studio believed in only moderately, the kind of mid-budget project that gets made because a director's track record buys him latitude rather than because anyone is certain it will work. He was 49 years old himself, the same age as Resta, though nothing else about the 2 men matched. He had a glass of bourbon in front of him on the felt. He had bought $200 in chips an hour earlier and had not touched most of them. He was not really playing. He was watching the dealer work, watching the rhythm of the room, the particular kind of watching that had become, over 2 decades of sets and sound stages, simply how he occupied a space when he was not required to perform in it. He had walked into the room 40 minutes earlier. He had not noticed Resta at the back table. The lighting in the room, low and concentrated over the felt, made the front and back tables feel like separate buildings entirely. He would not have cared regardless. He and Resta had never met. Eastwood did not know who owned the backroom concession. He had simply driven up the mountain for a few quiet days before the next picture's pre-production began, the way he had driven north on Highway 1 dozens of times before, looking for roads with nobody on them, and rooms where nobody required anything of him. Resta knew exactly who Eastwood was. He had recognized him the moment Eastwood walked through the door, had clocked the recognition the way certain men in certain businesses clock everything, instantly converting a person's identity into a rough calculation of how the person's presence might be useful, profitable, or simply worth commenting on to make himself look important in front of his table. Resta had been drinking for 3 hours. Resta had a particular weakness, well known to the regulars who played with him, for talking about Hollywood whenever a recognizable face wandered into his orbit, a habit that had less to do with genuine interest in the film business and more to do with establishing, loudly, that he was the kind of man important people walked past. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. It started small. Around 11 that evening, one of Resta's regulars, a younger man named Phil Tannen, who worked in commercial real estate in the East Bay and had been losing steadily for 2 hours, glanced toward the front of the room during a hand and noticed Eastwood at the bar table. He mentioned it, half under his breath, mostly to fill the silence between hands. Resta followed his eye line. He squinted through the low light and the cigarette haze. He could see, even from across the room, the lean frame, the worn canvas jacket hung over the back of the chair, the particular stillness of a man who was sitting without performing the act of sitting for anyone. "Eastwood," Resta said, loud enough for his whole table to hear. Tannen nodded. Resta picked up his drink. He took a long swallow. He said, "You know what I don't get about that guy?" Nobody answered. They had all heard versions of Resta's monologues before. There was no good answer. There was only waiting for it to pass. Resta continued anyway. He said the guy made his money on cowboy pictures 15 years ago and a cop picture in the 70s, and now he was out here pretending to direct, like that was a real thing a guy who could barely act his way through a Western was qualified to do. He said he'd read somewhere that Eastwood's last few pictures hadn't done much, that the studio was basically carrying him on reputation at this point, the way studios carry a lot of guys who got famous in the right decade and never figured out the business was going to keep moving without them. He said something to the effect that the town was full of has-beens who hadn't gotten the memo, and that from where he was sitting, Clint Eastwood looked like he was 3 pictures away from being one of them. Phil Tannen looked uncomfortable. The other 2 men at the table looked at their cards. Resta kept talking, warming to it the way men warm to a subject they have decided, somewhere in the bourbon, is both clever and safe to say, because the subject is 40 feet away and cannot possibly hear. He said he ought to go say hello, professional courtesy since they were both businessmen in their own way. Tannen said maybe that wasn't necessary. Resta said, "Nonsense. It was a free room. Everybody in this room was equal once they sat down at a table. That was the whole beauty of it. Didn't matter who you were outside these walls." He stood up. He picked up his drink. He walked the length of the room, weaving slightly between the empty tables, the loose, overconfident walk of a man who has had 3 hours to convince himself that confidence and good judgment are the same thing. He reached Eastwood's table. He pulled out the chair across from him without asking and sat down. He set his glass on the felt. He said, "Clint?" Eastwood looked up. His expression did not change. He said nothing, which was, for a certain kind of man, more unsettling than any greeting would have been. Resta said, "Dominic Resta. I own a piece of this operation. Heard you were up the mountain. Thought I'd come say hello. Professional to professional." Eastwood said, "That's so." Resta said, "That's so." He picked up his drink, took a sip, set it back down slightly too hard, the felt absorbing the small clack of glass on wood. He said, "Listen, no offense meant, but I gotta ask you something since we're both businessmen here. You ever worry the well's running dry?" Eastwood said, "Come again?" Resta said, "The well, Clint, the town's well. I read the trades, same as anybody. I know your last couple pictures didn't exactly light up the board office. Guys your age, guys who made their name in a different decade. Sometimes the town just moves on, and nobody tells you to your face. I'm telling you to your face. Professional courtesy. The dealer at Eastwood's table had stopped dealing. The two other quiet men at the table had gone still in the particular way people go still when they sense something is happening that is not about them, but might still require their attention. Eastwood looked at Resta for a long moment. He did not raise his voice. He said, "You finished?" Resta said, "I'm just being straight with you, that's all." One businessman to another. Eastwood said, "You're not a businessman, Dominic. You're a man who bought a piece of a casino and decided that meant you'd bought something else, too." He picked up his bourbon. He took a small, unhurried sip. He set it down. He said, "I've been doing this longer than you've owned that piece of paper that says you own part of this room. I directed my first picture the year you were probably still working for somebody else's casino, learning how to talk like this." He said it without heat, the way a man states a fact he has already confirmed and does not need to argue further. Resta's face had gone slightly red. The particular red of a man whose bourbon-fueled confidence has just hit something solid and not given way the way he expected it to. He said, "Hey, I'm just saying what everybody in this town already thinks." Eastwood said, "No, you're saying what you think, because you've had 3 hours to drink and 40 feet of empty room to walk across. And you decided that gave you something to say." He looked at him steadily. He said, "You don't know me, Dominic. You know a couple of headlines and a number from a trade paper you didn't read past the first paragraph of. That's not knowing a man's business. That's reading a stranger's mail and thinking you understand his life. Have you ever watched a man's confidence collapse from the inside out? Not from being shouted at, but from realizing, mid-sentence, that the ground he was standing on had never actually been there. It happens fast once it starts. Resta opened his mouth to respond. Nothing useful came out of it. He looked for a moment like a man trying to remember the second half of an argument he had only ever rehearsed the first half of. Eastwood said, "You want to talk business, Dominic? Talk to me about something you actually know. Talk to me about your gaming license, your minority stake structure, how the commission feels about the paperwork that keeps your name off the public filings. I'd wager I know less about your business than you think you know about mine. And I'd still wager I'm closer to right than you are." He let that sit for a moment. Resta did not have an answer. The bar in the corner had gone quiet enough that Lou Carbone, polishing a glass he had already polished twice, could hear every word from 15 feet away. Eastwood said finally, "Take your drink back to your table, Dominic. Your guests are waiting on you. And from where I sit, it looks like at least one of them already knows better than to repeat what you just said to a stranger." He did not say it loudly. He said it the way he said most things, at a volume that asked nothing of the room and required nothing of the room in return. The same even register from the first word to the last. Resta sat there for a moment. 1 second, 2, 3, 4. He picked up his drink. He stood up. He walked back across the room, slower than he had walked over, the loose confidence gone out of his stride entirely, replaced by the particular stiffness of a man trying to walk normally while every part of him wants to walk faster. He sat back down at his own table. Phil Tannen and the other two men did not ask him what had happened. They had heard enough of it from across the room to understand they did not need to ask. The dealer at Eastwood's table resumed dealing. Eastwood picked up his cards. He played the hand the same unhurried way he had been playing all night. Lou Carbone, behind the bar, finished polishing the glass he had been holding and set it down, and did not say anything to anyone for the rest of the shift, though he thought about what he had just witnessed for the better part of the next decade, in the particular way that bartenders carry the things they overhear and never repeat, until eventually some of them decide that certain things deserve to outlive the silence. Dominic Resta left the Cal-Neva that night without finishing his last hand. He did not come back to the back room for the remainder of that week, an absence the regular dealers noticed and did not comment on. His minority stake in the gaming operation was sold off within 18 months, in early 1981, to a larger holding company restructuring the lodge's ownership ahead of a planned renovation, a sale that the trade gossip at the time attributed to financial pressures unrelated to anything that happened on the casino floor, and which may well have been exactly that, since men like Resta tend to accumulate financial pressures from many directions at once, and rarely from a single conversation, however uncomfortable. He moved to Reno. He ran a smaller operation there through most of the 1980s. He died in 1994 at the age of 64 of complications from cirrhosis, a fact noted only in a brief paid obituary in a Reno newspaper that mentioned his casino career in 2 sentences and his survivors in 3. Eastwood checked out of the Cal-Neva 2 days later, as planned, and drove back down the mountain to Carmel. He never mentioned the encounter publicly, not in any interview, not in any documentary made about his career in the decades that followed, not in the published collections of anecdotes that circulate among film historians who track these things obsessively. The story exists today because Lou Carbone, the bartender, told it once, late in his own life, in 2009, to a journalist working on an oral history of the old Cal-Neva for a regional Nevada historical magazine doing a retrospective piece on the lodge's pre-renovation decades. Carbone was 81 years old at the time of the interview. He had kept the story for 30 years. He explained, when the journalist asked why he had never mentioned it before, that for most of those 30 years, the only point of telling it would have been to make Resta look bad to people who had mostly forgotten Resta existed anyway. And that seemed, to Carbone, like punching a dead man who could no longer punch back. He said he had decided to finally tell it because the magazine piece was specifically about the room itself, the back room, what had actually happened inside those knotty pine walls over the decades the lodge had operated, and it seemed wrong, in that specific context, to leave out the one night he had personally watched a loud man discover, in real time, exactly how much weight his own opinion actually carried once somebody finally weighed it back. The Cal-Neva Lodge underwent a major renovation beginning in 2016, reopening years later as a restored luxury property trading heavily on its Rat Pack-era mystique, its Sinatra connections, its tunnel rumored to connect to a cabin once used by Marilyn Monroe. The back room where the encounter took place no longer exists in its original form. The space was reconfigured entirely during the renovation. There is no plaque anywhere on the property referencing Dominic Resta or the night in June of 1979. There is no marketing material that mentions it, because almost no one beyond Lou Carbone and the 4 men at Resta's table that night ever knew it happened at all. And 3 of those 4 men are now dead, and the 4th, Phil Tannen, gave a brief confirming quote to the same regional magazine in 2009 before declining to elaborate further, saying only that he remembered exactly 2 things about that night 30 years later: that Resta had said something stupid, and that whatever Eastwood said back to him had taken less than a minute and had ended the conversation more completely than anything Tannen had ever watched happen at a card table before or since. There is a particular kind of correction that some men deliver with their fists, and some men deliver with their wallets, and some men deliver, more rarely, simply by refusing to let a false thing stand unanswered in the room where it was said, using nothing but the plain weight of accurate information delivered at a volume that asks for no audience and requires no witnesses to validate it. Eastwood did not need Resta to apologize. He did not need Resta to admit he was wrong in front of his table, though Resta's silence on the walk back across the room amounted to exactly that. He simply said what was true once, in the same tone he had used to order his bourbon, and let the truth do whatever work truth does once it has finally been spoken into a room that had, until that moment, only contained one man's very loud and very wrong opinion of himself. That is the whole of it. That is what 4 minutes at a felt table in the back room of a half-forgotten lodge above Lake Tahoe actually contained. And unfortunately, they do not make men like that anymore. If this story reached you, pass it on. Share it with someone who has learned the difference between confidence and accuracy the hard way. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.